We're going to take a look at taking a pencil sketch. This is done on Bristol surface, the smooth version, and I've used an H pencil, so the line weight is very minimal. There's not a lot of texture or soft graphite that can be spread around, and this will be something that can be erased at the end once the ink is completely dry. My ink is Black Star India ink. It's waterproof, meaning if I drop something that's wet over top of this later on, the lines aren't going to bleed. That's not my plan, but you never know what happens to your art when you let it go. But we're going to use cross-hatching, and I'm going to use a selection of nibs, starting with a Gillet 303, very flexible point, gives you a lot of calligraphic kind of marks, thick and thin. And you can see, hopefully in the upper corner, and I'll just slide the camera over a little bit, my ink is in a little plastic jar. I've taped it down to the surface so it's not going to move around accidentally and end up being spilled. I also have my still life set up right there, and there'll be a picture that you can look at later. So I have my board, meaning my Bristol, ready to go. It's going to be movable because I'm not going to try to make this a permanent surface where I have to try to get my hand moving around the whole thing at all these weird angles. When I need to make a stroke, I'm going to move this to make the stroke in a comfortable manner. And the first step for me is to go into focal point, because if I mess something up, I'm going to redo it. I don't want to get to the end and say, oh, the eyes need to be done still, and all of a sudden I've spent an hour or so on something that needs to be thrown away because I've ruined it with the eyes. So I'm dipping my nib, and I'm using my little scrap sheet here to make sure that the flow is working. And you can have a drawing ready to go. You can have your still life set up in front of you. Just make sure that you remember to look up if you've got it set up. So initially, I'm looking at a relatively dark space here, and this will be kind of a focal point in there. I may end up coming back in and getting rid of the white lines that are in there at the moment, but it is relatively dark in there. And I'm going to use the directional sort of qualities that you can see in the cavity. With being able to spin this around, you're looking for what's the comfortable stroke direction. And don't feel like it needs to be a consistent thing where the stroke that you make has to be achieved from end to end, point A to point B. There are absolutely points and moments where you can take a pause, come back in and go back over a line, continue a line that might have stopped and started. And I'm planning to take some cross-hatching over this, so initially I'm just going to continue flowing around this curvature. To achieve something in the darker region, darker value range. So I can pick these lines up and continue them. I could dash the mark here or there. And as much as possible, I have the drawing such that if I turn it like this, I'm not going to feel lost. But obviously the concern with pen and ink is that it's not going to be erasable. It's not going to be able to be corrected if you make a big mistake. So it's a high wire act at times. But nothing ventured, nothing gained here, right? We're trying to have something basically styled in cross-hatching that is really useful in a lot of different parts of the illustration world to be thinking about hatching and directional mark making. Communicates the form, communicates that that's rounding inward. And while I'm thinking about the outer edge here, I'm going to go in and emphasize the contour. Now, the light is from above. You can see sort of a cast shadow on the left side. I'm indicating that light coming down this way. It's common to see the underplane, the underside, be a little bit thicker or darker as a contour edge. And to contrast that with, say, this edge here, which would be receiving a little bit more light, by contrasting that underplane being a little darker, you create the illusion of a little bit of lighting essentially in your scene or on your form without really needing the shading always to do it for you. Alright, so this side of the cavity needs a change in direction, and really it's almost like ceiling and wall in terms of what I see going on there. So I don't know that it needs to be a consistent curvature that rounds all the way over. And these lines have gotten to the point where they're kind of dry. I can let some of these ceiling lines, if you will, start to filter over, and I will dash them or create a little stipple as it goes across that achieves a little bit of continuity, which lets you, if you perceive that line going across or not, it's something that will help the viewer manage the transition. So I'll do that with the wall lines essentially as well. Just a couple little tick marks, maybe it's a dot here or there. And I might leave this to dry for sure before I do any more in there, and move over to the other eye, which has mostly curvature this way, and it is a little bit lighter. But you got to find that direction that makes sense to you when you're drawing it. I may end up wanting to go in here first and introduce the contour. Letting that line fade out. I could certainly switch to a different nib if I didn't feel comfortable letting the stroke weight control some of this. But I can also take that direction of the nib, the way I'm holding it, and let it, instead of going lengthwise here with the barrel of the pen, take it kind of more perpendicular. and allow for a thinner stroke to feel more comfortable coming off of that pen. So I'm looking at how that transitions thick into thin. The nasal bone here is going to overlap. So it's common to also see the weight come onto the figure or the edge that is in the foreground. And by doing that, we're playing with the perceived depth. And because these connect so much, if I screw up the nose too, that would be another area where I'd maybe think about redoing something if it was super challenging to find a fix or find a solution to a line. So I'm relating this right into that. I'm going to continue drawing off of it before I finish in the orbit of the eye there. Pretty dark in here. You may end up using a brush at times if there's a big area to fill in with a black. And so that's a personal preference, but if you use a brush, make sure it's comfortable in your hand. It's not too big for what you need to do. And if you're using that nib here to fill in a lot of black, be attentive to the white shapes that you see happening so that you don't cover up what you are endeavoring to save. So that becomes a little bit of a plane into the back of the cavity, and let that brighten up as it comes forward. But absolutely, we can go back into these later. Sometimes the corrective solution literally is to blacken it in and create a new impression of that space, that shape. It's called spotting your blacks. And really that's sometimes the make or break it of a piece, is how do you balance the light and dark, but really how do you balance the heavy use of black? Is it in one area only? Is it happening with intent based on lighting, where something drops away and becomes a silhouette essentially of what it was trying to do? So you could absolutely take this moment in here and blacken it in with a brush. I don't necessarily gain anything by doing it with the nib right now. Every now and then your nib is you can see that round bump on the end. It's grabbing some of the paper. And I've been using this nib for a while, so it's also a good idea to rinse it off, draw it on your paper towel here, get it as clean as you can so that you're not gunking it up and making it more difficult to work with. And then we can go back in. Just be careful that you don't get water into your inkwell. Okay, I am not wanting a really dark line on this side of the nasal cavity, so something relatively thin. And I'm looking at trying to use this side of the nib, harder to get started sometimes. A directional plane. And I might go in and darken that later, but it's at least a starting point. And I'll darken it either by retracing those lines or crossing them up a different direction. But I'm feeling ready to kind of come into here now, and based on direction that's easy to draw, I'm going to take those curvatures in here this way. So it's a lighter eye, and I know that I'm going to end up cross-hatching in the other one a little bit. So I'm kind of replicating some of the value range, but I also want it to feel like it's going to sink back and get a little brighter as it goes this way. So I'm going to let it brighten as I come forward. And I might do a little cross-hatching just to keep the consistency between the two eyes, where it doesn't look like I did one thing on one eye and didn't do that similar approach on the other side. If I end up going really dark there, I might space out a line on either side. And so again, with problem solving, finding a way to work with what you've just created is, it's half the battle here with a pen and ink drawing. I want it to get a little darker there. So I'm looking at it and saying I do want a little bit of cross-hatching later. It's going to help finesse the value, as well as consistency with the other side. My already planned approach to that side anyway. As I come in contact with this top contour edge, I can be really, attentive to what's happening there, and maybe I want those strokes to almost kind of feather out of it. And that's certainly personal preference. But it's selling that underplane a little bit more, darkening it up. All right, so typically I would continue to work around some of the key moments and think about those relationships of light into shadow. And so this is on the shadow side, but it also has a moment of kind of surface connection. So it can get even thicker right there. Much thicker as it is on the shadow side of the form. And so as I would come over here, I want to make sure I can get a thin stroke. And start, stop, stipple. Where that line goes in behind the cheekbone here, I might even stipple it so it brightens it and lets it fade back behind it when I introduce a heavier stroke above it. So thin into thick, overlap, foreground comes forward because it's a heavier stroke. Find the direction that's comfortable for your hand to move, and make sure that you're aware of where you've already drawn. So going up here would be dangerous for me. I'm going to make sure that I continue flowing along the back edge here. And I have this cool reflected light portion right there, and so I'm going to look for that, the cranium here to be brighter at the top, and it gets into a shadow moment right around here. But then it thins out because I get some reflected light. So I'm going to let that stroke actually break up. So I'm just looking for it to have some life, have a little variety. And I feel like there's intent behind the line then. It's not random. I'm trying to make it do something. there's a moment here I'm just going to start hatching. Even let that go to full black there, where this is going to hit the ground on the back. I'm going to start to bring that cast shadow out eventually from that moment as well. Okay, so I'm going to take and switch this to kind of a time lapse, go around some of the more contour lines, emphasizing those thicks and thins. I would normally continue this process until the line work is kind of a coloring book, and then I'll go back in with my cross hatching and start to turn forms, turn shades into planes on the figure. So we're going to take a step back and watch me speed the process up. So now that a lot of the contour information has been determined, again, emphasizing those shadow sides being a little thicker, the lines that recede behind something, I've stippled a line out, or I've left a little gap every now and then, and opened up a little gap where that light might be more prominent at times. Now I'm ready to go into a little bit more detail with the hatching. Remember to rinse your nib out if you're going to use a nib. If you've got one of these that slots into the brown pen holder, be sure that your water, if you're going to rinse it out, doesn't get trapped up in there, because it could accidentally drip out or change the value of your ink. So make sure you got a good paper towel to clear that up. But I've been using the Gillette 303 and then a Hunt 108, which is a pretty common introductory nib. It's going to give you a lot of resistance in thick and thin. You know, there's a flexible point as you're balancing it on a piece of paper. You can see the tines separate pretty easily, but there's a little bit more fine control than the bigger nib I was using earlier. And I'm going to use this one for a little bit more of the actual interior hatching, just like the way that it lays down the line a little bit more. So I'm testing things out over here on a scrap sheet, and then you essentially call the play out as much as you can have ready to go from whether a sketch or from life, that you can see what's going on there. Then look for a plan and then go do it. And it doesn't necessarily matter where I start, but I do want to keep in mind where my hand might want to go later on, and make sure it's not wet. And so like this part here, I'm looking at the plane and the direction, and I have a light pencil line laid in to essentially determine where to stop. I can't get that one started. Remember, you just drip a little ink onto a scrap sheet and you can flow right out of that. So I'm just checking the direction there. I may want to cross that pretty soon. So I'll fade it out a little bit so that it becomes a smaller mark. And then I'm going to come back over top this way. There's not a lot of ink on that surface, so I'm not worried about crossing it so soon that it hasn't had a chance to dry yet or anything. But And again, transition. So a couple stipples, little hatch marks, will help you achieve a relationship that the line work seems to fade into the next portion of it, that it rounds over. So the heavy line there, I'm stippling that out. I'm leaving a little gap. There's a little bit of brightness there. It fades down and under a little bit, and then it moves, behind this overlap here a little bit. So this initial stippled area, I want to let fade back in. So this does feel like it goes under. So some small marks. And I might jump into the nose here for a minute, because those are not dark enough, or the area around this opening. So it's been dry. I'm not scraping a damp piece of paper with a metal nib. If you're working with a felt tip pen, you don't have to worry about that. Once again, we're looking at the white space. Let's say I want to continue that in and cross hatch over top now. So it seems to fade back. There's a little detailing going on there in terms of shape change. And when you do that, just keep squinting, keep looking at what's the impression of those lines. What tone do they become? Get a little more detail there. I want a very thin thickness to the nasal cavity and the bone around it. So I'm going to make sure I get that eventually here defined, and it's going to go from a line into hatching. So I started to break it up with some stippling, and I think that transition can be really interesting. One into the next type of line or type of form. Shaping some of the earlier lines, there's too much brightness back there, so just thickening them a little bit. It's a gradation of white, starting out a little thicker, getting a little thinner, 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 very thin at the back. And just getting very picky about things. If some of those forms start to feel like they advance forward, I want to find a way to drop them back. And sometimes that's shaping them, sometimes it's going to be crossing their direction a little bit here, so that I imply that plane continuing back there and achieving perspective, essentially. It's not super black up there, so there's some luminosity in this space. But again, I'm continuing to look at what is there. Maybe that needs to go black there. A little darker. And you can go over the spotted blacks if you're using your nib with the brush later on. All right, let's do a little bit more literal hatching. I'm just rinsing the nib off and scraping across the paper a little bit. This whole side is in shadow, but I'm not going to start just bouncing around. I'm going to look for a darker region so I can get comfortable. This had a thicker weight here initially, and it's essentially a coarse shadow. So I'm going to start by looking at that as an area where I can add in some good darks. maybe I can get by with just using hatching with the thickness variation here as I'm moving towards some of the suture lines on the skull. I might zigzag and sort of add a little more textural detail there. Can always come back in with more after the fact, but if I can balance that with the white space, can make that job a little easier. And so from the transition here, like this is very lightly penciled in, effectively the shadow shape. So I know kind of where to start tapering off. And I'm not going in blind. I'm not going in and trying to guess where that needs to end. But soften it out with my stipples or a little thinner stroke. The thin strokes are really easy to go back in and darken if you need to. But I'm also trying to look at the contour and say, well, am I starting to make it too vertical? Do I need to think about a direction this way? Am I going to crosshatch? I'm starting to think a couple steps ahead. And so if you're not quite sure what your intent is yet, jump to another spot where you do know what it is. Where I want this to kind of echo that initial line off of it a little bit and add a little more thickness. But by not just making it a big thick line, letting that little white space in there, it allows it to round a little bit more. Wraps under. I might go in and shape that a little bit more once this is dry and just play with the light and dark a little bit, but this wraps forward. There's kind of a plane change right about here, and this is relatively flat. There's a little contour change, but before I get there, I'm thinking I want to look at that moment of separation between light and shadow. I've got a very faint pencil stroke and add a pretty significant line that I'm going to thin out and echo. And then I'm going to start to follow what's happening. This line seems to want to cross over and pick up the thickness here in terms of a core shadow on that form. And again, I'm going to take something that's out here and start to pull it up and over. So horizontal transitioning into something more diagonal. Get a nice dark spot in here. I want to be careful not to lose that as I throw other values on top of it. But what can we do to look at a shape here, and what shape is it? What direction makes sense if I start down by the teeth? This slant, got a light pencil line in there already. Be a good place to begin. I'm going to start just shy of the teeth. There's a little gap there. And I'm going to offer up a little variation in there, meaning my directional change a little bit, start to imply a faceting. I've tried to be careful about highlights in here being penciled in. so I know not to run into them. And every now and then just stop, take a look at what you're looking at. Be sure that you're not forgetting something or that you've missed in the pencil sketch something that's going to be important. It's going to cross over here, cross hatching a little bit. And when I do that, I know that I'm going to want to bring some resolution to this with another shape, another angle. As a way to transition from the marks around the nose. There's nothing telling me I can't eventually come back and go another angle if I need to. So I'm going to start to pick up some of the brightness and highlights the form of the teeth as they go back up and under. And so this is on the shadow side of the hill, essentially. So this form has kind of a tubular feeling going up and over. That's not something I achieved on this side, and so this would be a good time to think about pushing that as a cross. Bring that over this way. And look for the transition up into the shading that I had up around the nasal bone. In the light areas, I want to be very specific and try to do a little less than I see. Blow it out a little bit. So I do a little bit more drawing in the actual shaded areas, halftone areas, than I do in the light areas. Very minimal. Keep it subtle. As I have teeth in here, the teeth were first and foremost about that triangular space. So you want to look for what do you see when you squint, and you see those spaces between where the gums would be, maybe some of the lines as they connect in. But when I actually start to look at the teeth themselves, I'm looking for simplification. There is a plane that is sort of implied here, kind of rounded over, and somewhat of a core shadow. It's kind of a tube-like form, but do less. Do much less than you think is necessary. You want the teeth to feel bright, at least right now, at least on my skull. It doesn't have a lot of aging to it. And if your nib is not working, make sure you get it started on another sheet. Don't keep scraping over the same area, or you may actually release the ink unexpectedly. So I have a front plane that's in a little shadow. There's some light. This area goes a little darker. There's this little gap in there, and just for clarity, I'm going to knock it back. I'm seeing some actual brightness back there, but it's competing with the teeth. So you make an executive decision to drop something back. I'm going to avoid doing really any cross-hatching if I can on the teeth to achieve some contrast between them and the rest of this skull. This is on the shadow side of something, so that thicker stroke makes sense there. So hopefully we can pick up this brighter area, and these become just little cylinders. The rest of the teeth are all in shadow, and I want to make them, very clear with regard to the darker recessed moments. So I'm going to go back in and thicken a couple of those moments, or fill in a light area. Just make it black, spotting the black effectively in that point, and making sure that the little white moments are maybe more useful somewhere else on the form. And look for opportunities to roll it away. So this can start out, but it can get a little thicker potentially as it comes up and inserts, so that there's some roundness achieved as well. So again, kind of thin, a little thicker. And because I've accentuated those moments of negative space or dark space between teeth, you start to get clarity, even though I'm using the lines nearly going in the same direction. In this case, I'm looking for this to the bottom molar there to roll back under, be under the shadow a little, and roll out a little bit towards the light. Same thing here, so that means I'm thickening more at the top and thinner strokes coming downward. Group some of that. Maybe some of that can go black even. So you simplify it. The little bit of gap here in the background, maybe some of this needs to go a little darker even, or go full black for clarity. You're not gaining anything back there necessarily. So you continue to edit these things as you're going. Decisions that you've made initially might not work once other areas are rendered in. Lay them down, then thicken a little bit. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the teeth. I'll do some of that in a few minutes, but I'm going to bounce around and start to pull some variation in here. Separation between this area and that area. And I see a lot of gradient here. And so this could be something that I twist, make sure nothing else is wet up here, and pull pressure into thinner strokes. Pressure into a thinner stroke. I still want to be in shadow, so I'm going to make sure it goes all the way under. And I'm going to look at how this might change. So there is a twisting kind of form here. Gone in already with some. I'm going to let this cross over even and start to come forward this way to beef up the dark. But I also want a directional quality. And what I'm going to start with is fanning this over a little bit. Pay attention to what happens. See where the brightness rolls directionally. I want this to start twisting and flowing that direction. I'm going to cross hatch over that, I think, at some point, but it gets me started. It's very wet. I want to make sure I don't mess that up too much. But as I get down to here, I'm going to echo this heavyweight line, stipple it, start and stop it a little bit. That's going to help round it out a little. We get a little reflected light even, so that gap between there can stand in for that essentially. But all these things can flow into the next line. And you're going to get comfortable knowing which way to go just through sheer doing and practice. So if it doesn't feel right the first time, remember the next time, just do a test somewhere else. So I'm transitioning that, and I'm going to let it transition up and over this way as well. We get a lot of texture here. I'm going to have a light area and essentially dividing into the shadow side at this point. So more texture, more stippling might be useful there. Keep moving. Where you think you know what you want to do, go there. So I'm looking, there's always an option. There's always a way of going one direction versus another direction, and one might be better. And so a lot of times I'll be sort of practicing or echoing it in the air before I actually do it. I'm trying to think about what I'm going to do over here, what this line is already doing. And so I might just continue these. And see how they're looking. You can always stop and try it a different way. Because this direction makes just as much sense. And it needs to be darker anyway. This direction could make sense. And so how can you flow from something that already exists? So I was seeing that relationship over to the initial lines I had on the other side. I like that. I'm going to move this way now, I think. Shaping off an initial line that I already had in there. And continue moving. Let's move to the back of the skull a little bit. Get some of that shading in. Rinsed my nib off. Get it started again. Make sure you feel comfortable with that. Got a really strong suture line that is a great place to build off of. Because if it's too dark there, it's just contributing to that division. So there's a little bit of extra brightness there, and I'm trying to think about what I want to do in relationship to that. It's brighter than here, it's brighter than there. I need 3 values essentially right there, each distinct. But I like the idea of this echoing off. So I'm going to let these cross. Obviously deepens the value in here, which hopefully you were watching and paying attention to so that it could do that. These are freshly drawn, so you're going to potentially need to clean your nib off a little bit if it scrapes up some paper. And then every now and then you might stipple a line up so this crosses and it doesn't feel abrupt. And likewise, I'm going to bring the illusion of this kind of, sorry, I'm spinning this around, rounding over a little bit more. So that change in direction doesn't feel totally out of left field. And this was drawn on much earlier, so it's had a good chance to dry. But ideally, you can see that curve. You can see that feeling like it's wrapping. If it's not helping the form, then you need to rethink what you were doing there. All right, so I'm going to take again some more time in a sped up version, go in and fill in some more cross hatching, and we'll see where we're at. So as this time lapse gets underway, I'm sorry for the jerky nature of what's happening as the board keeps turning, but it is absolutely imperative that you keep moving the orientation so that you have a confident stroke, a stroke that you know the direction that it needs to go, and you know how that starts, whether it's thick or thin, as I'm cross-contouring the interior of the eye socket here, pushing the darkness back a little bit more. And as we move into these flatter areas, maybe around the brow, looking for a transition from more vertical into more diagonal, and vice versa. Once you've got something in there, it doesn't mean you can't go back in, especially once it's dry, to darken something a little bit further and push an area back a little bit. As you move into the lighter areas, it's really important that you use those small dashes to break up your line a little bit so it's not as powerfully dark. And so you'll see me sort of dotting the end like an exclamation point. So with that crosshatch now in the eye socket, the depth is a great deal more significant now. It sinks back into space. And any kind of volume, on the nasal bone there, I can see a core shadow that I'm trying to achieve there. So you get a little bit more depth with that. And as I transition to the cast shadow, I'm really trying to push the thin to thick so that there's a little bit more dark as the form is touching the surface or a little closer to the surface, and as we fade out towards the left, the lines are going to get thinner. I'm using a pretty organic approach here where it's not a very direct thickness of line the whole way. I don't start on one side and go all the way to the other. I'm trying to make it a little more random, and that's to change the surface quality between the ground plane as well as the bone. But thin to thick, and this is going to be the first layer. You're going to see some cross-hatching later on. Because I want it to thin out towards the edge, makes sense to flip this thing upside down so I can start with the pressure on the left side since I'm a righty and drag it outward. Going in, paying attention to the white spaces. I'm absolutely going to come back to that after those marks have dried. Here I'm going in and looking at kind of feathering those strokes into the dark recessed shadow underneath the jaw. And that means really looking at not a 90-degree angle with the end of a white shape, but make it look like there's needles going into it, going into the black, that is. And here I'm really starting to push the cross-hatching, where the jaw was mostly hatching, thin to thick. The back of the cranium had a lot of cross-hatching already, so it felt a little different. Even if the value was getting close to where it needed to be, I needed to bring those cross-hatches into it so the form of the skull looks like it was created similarly from back to front. And I'm really trying to group those shapes here. So what kind of dark shapes do I see in there? There's going to be a couple different values to be sure in any one area. And so where does that boundary line between a mid-tone and a darker mid-tone happen? And is it soft-edged, hard-edged? Trying to look at how those edges might feather out with the different lines that are applied. So beginning the cross-hatching here on the shadow, I'm really looking at what the light source was doing, which was providing a little bit of a change of brightness between the interior of the cavity of the skull, a little bit of light spilling through it. And I want to transition those heavy lines from the back of the head up towards the forehead. That really kind of connects a similar approach that I had down on the jawline with really heavy thin to thick, and then some nice thin lines to start to taper in across the forehead. So I'm mixing thin and thick and trying to be balanced with that approach. And as I go into the lighter area of the top of the head, I'm using a very thin application, using the side of the nib where those tines aren't going to separate and release a lot of ink. And pushing in some dark areas, we're getting close to more final assessments and really just establishing what's bright and what's darker and what needs to come forward. So what I'm doing now is going in and making final value assessments, squinting my eyes and keeping a big eye on where the forms are turning and making sure that the buildup of all the little lines has a solid impression of mass or grouping, if you will. And keeping track of where forms are in front of another form, being sure that there is enough contrast. So sometimes that means going back over some lines that are already existing. It can also mean strengthening the blacks, solid blacks. You know, that maybe they need to occasionally be filled in. Little areas in here, I think they hold together pretty good, but there could be a design decision that you make and say it needs to be more solid black just to make it push the main figure forward. I've tried to crosshatch in the shadow here to achieve sort of overlapping shadows and softer edge where that just hatching exists now, but there may be a moment or two in here where you squint and you say some of those shapes stand out a little bit more, or it could benefit from going darker. Overall, as a surface to push the main skull form forward. Now, when I look up at the subject, there are some more ambiguous areas that fade together, and you just need to make that call whether or not the piece benefits from ambiguity here. I've got some strong lines that help pull the figure forward, but maybe I want the shadow to be just a little darker. So there's still some impact there. Now there's some light spilling in the shadow, and I want to maintain some of that because the skull itself has some openings and it's not a completely solid form. So I do want that extra brightness there. But I'm also looking at its relationship with the portion of the skull that overlaps. Maybe that has a better spill effect going in there. So it's final decisions, little marks, one little mark, one little scratch that will, set something back into space, set it behind another form because of the value contrast that you're establishing. But for all intents and purposes, I would say that's done. Make sure you rinse your nib off in the sink and give yourself a little time to let it sit. Come back to it with fresh eyes and see if another line needs to be added in 2 or 3 spots, and then you're done. And here we have the finished piece. I hope everyone's picked up some good tips or tricks, and that the first attempts at cross-hatching go well. Thank you.